to squeeze in there. All right.
Squeeze in too?
Yeah, that's possible. Perfect. Okay, great. Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all to Book Soup tonight. We are so pleased to have with us tonight Alain de Botton, and he is going to be reading from his new book, which is How Proust Can Change Your Life. And we will also open up the floor to questions, have a little Q&A following. So enjoy yourself. Go.
Thank you. This is a rather unusual book for any of those of you who've picked it up. It's basically a cross between two things: a self-help book and a study of Proust. The two perhaps aren't really thought of normally as going together, but it struck me reading Proust that he was a man who was incredibly wise and had many things to tell us about life, and that it seemed to me that he might be the ideal candidate for such a study. I'd always been very attracted to self-help books. They're a much denigrated genre. I think that their main problem is that most of them are very bad. However, the idea behind them, the idea of a book that will in some way help to change your life, is a very attractive one. And that's why at some point I decided to put the two things together and ended up with this Proustian self-help book. Perhaps the best thing to do is to read from a couple of chapters, just to give you a flavour of what's inside the book, and then perhaps have some questions afterwards. So the book opens with a chapter called How to Love Life Today, and this really sets the scene for the Proustian book. So here goes. There are few things humans are more dedicated to than unhappiness. Had we been placed on earth by a malign creator for the exclusive purpose of suffering, we would have good reason to congratulate ourselves on an enthusiastic response to this task. Reasons to be inconsolable abound. The fickleness of love, the insincerities of social life, the compromises of friendship, the deadening effects of habit. In the face of such persistent ills, we might naturally expect that no event would be awaited with greater anticipation than the moment of our own extinction. Someone looking for a paper to read in Paris in the 1920s might have picked up a title called L'Intransigeant. It had a reputation for investigative news, metropolitan gossip, and comprehensive classifieds. It also had a habit of dreaming up big questions and asking French celebrities to send in their replies. What do you think would be the ideal education to give your daughter was one. Do you have any recommendations for improving traffic congestion in the city of Paris was another. In the summer of 1922, the paper formulated a particularly elaborate question for its contributors. I quote, "An American scientist announces that the world will end, or at least that such a huge part of the continent will be destroyed, and in such a sudden way, that death will be the certain fate of hundreds of millions of people. If this prediction were confirmed, what do you think would be its effects on people between the time when they acquired the aforementioned certainty and the moment of cataclysm? Finally, as far as you're concerned, what would you do in this very last hour?" The first celebrity to respond to this grim scenario of personal and global annihilation was a then distinguished, now forgotten man of letters named Henri Bordeaux, who suggested that it would drive the mass of the population directly into either the nearest church or the nearest bedroom, though he himself avoided this awkward choice, explaining that he would take this last opportunity to climb a mountain so as to admire the beauty of alpine scenery and flora. Another Parisian celebrity, an accomplished actress called Berthe Bovy, proposed no recreations of her own, but she did share with her readers a coy concern that men would shed all their inhibitions once their actions had ceased to carry long-term consequences. This dark prognosis matched that of a famous Parisian palm reader, Madame Freya, who judged that people would omit to spend their last hours contemplating the extraterrestrial future, and would be too taken up with worldly pleasures to give any thought to readying their souls for the afterlife. A suspicion which was unfortunately confirmed when an other writer, Henri Robert, blithely declared his intention to devote himself in his final hours to a final game of bridge, tennis, and then golf. The last celebrity to be consulted on his pre-apocalypse plans was a reclusive, mustachioed novelist, not known for his interest in golf, tennis, or bridge, though he had once tried checkers and twice aided in the launching of a kite. A man who had spent the last 14 years lying in a narrow bed under a pile of thinly woven woolen blankets, writing an unusually long novel without the aid of an adequate bedside lamp. Since the publication of its first volume in 1913, In Search of Lost Time had been hailed as a masterpiece. The author had been compared to Shakespeare, an Italian critic had likened him to Stendhal, and an Austrian princess had offered her hand in marriage. Though he had never esteemed himself highly, and had once referred to himself as a flea and his writing as a piece of indigestible nougat, Marcel Proust had grounds for satisfaction. Even the British ambassador to France, a man of wide acquaintance and cautious judgment, had deemed it appropriate to bestow on him a great, if not directly literary honour, describing Proust as the most remarkable man I have ever met, because he keeps his overcoat on at dinner. Enthusiastic about contributing to newspapers, and in any case a good sport, Proust sent the following reply to L'Intransigeant and its catastrophic American scientist. I quote from Proust's reply, "I think that life would suddenly seem wonderful to us if we were threatened to die, as you say. Just think of how many projects, travels, love affairs, and studies it, our life, hides from us, made invisible by our laziness, which, certain of a future, delays these projects indefinitely. But let all this threaten to become impossible forever, and how beautiful it would immediately become again. Ah, if only the cataclysm doesn't happen this time, then we won't miss visiting the new galleries of the Louvre. We won't miss throwing ourselves at the feet of Miss X. We won't miss making that trip to India. However, the cataclysm doesn't happen, and we don't do any of it, because we find ourselves back in the heart of normal life, where negligence deadens desire. And yet, we shouldn't have needed a cataclysm to love life today. It would have been enough to think that we are humans, and that death may come this very evening." Feeling suddenly attached to life when we realize the imminence of death suggests that it was perhaps not life itself which we had lost the taste for, so long as there was no end in sight. However, if due acknowledgement of our mortality encourages us to reevaluate our priorities, we might well ask what these priorities should be and what we should be doing before the cataclysm hits us. Proust's suggestions, the Louvre, love, and India, were not particularly helpful. For a start, they were rather at odds with what one knows of his character. He had never been an avid museum visitor, he hadn't been to the Louvre in over a decade, and he preferred to look at reproductions rather than face the chatter of a museum crowd. Here's why in a letter that he wrote to a friend. "People think the love of literature, painting, and music has become extremely widespread, whereas in fact there isn't a single person who understands anything about them." Nor was Proust known for his interest in the Indian subcontinent, which was in any case rather a trial to reach, requiring a train down to Marseille, a mail boat to Port Said, and then 10 days on a P&O liner across the Arabian Sea, which was hardly an ideal itinerary for a man with difficulty stepping out of bed. As for Miss X, to his mother's distress, Marcel had never really proved very receptive to her charms, nor indeed to those of the Mrs. A to Z. And it was a long time since Proust had even bothered to ask if there was a younger brother at hand, having concluded that a glass of well-chilled beer usually offered a more reliable source of pleasure than love-making. But even if he had wanted to act according to his proposals, Proust turned out to have had little chance. Only 4 months after sending his reply to L'Intransigeant, having predicted that something like this would happen for years, Proust caught a cold and died. He was 51. Fortunately, Proust's reflections on how to live were not limited to an all-too-brief and somewhat confusing reply to a fanciful question from a newspaper, because right up to his death, he'd been at work on a book that set out to answer, albeit in a rather extended and narratively complex form, a question which was not dissimilar to the one provoked by the predictions of the fictional American scientist. The title of the long book hinted as much. Though Proust never liked it and referred to it variously as unfortunate, misleading, and plain ugly, In Search of Lost Time had the advantage of pointing directly enough to a central theme of the novel, a search for the causes behind the dissipation and the loss of time. Far from a memoir tracing the passage of a more lyrical age, this was a practical and universally applicable story about how to stop wasting and start to appreciate time. Though the announcement of an imminent apocalypse could no doubt make this a concern uppermost in anyone's mind, the Proustian guidebook held out a hope that this topic could detain us a little before personal or global annihilation was at hand, and that we might therefore learn to adjust our priorities before it was time to have a last game of golf and keel over. So that's the first chapter of the book, which sets the scene. There are then a host of chapters that delineate Proust's more helpful advice on how we should live life. It's of course a paradox that Proust was one of the great sick men of literature. He was remarkably unhappy, he was remarkably ill, and yet nevertheless there's a stream of wisdom that comes from him. Part of that paradox is resolved by Proust's own theory about how it is that we ever come to learn anything. In Proust's view, when we're comfortable, when we're happy, we're not actually in any good position to start making intellectual discoveries, because happiness doesn't really incite us to make discoveries. As a sort of practical example, it's only when our car breaks down that we're led to think about how the engine works. And if you apply that idea to the sort of psychological workings of our brains, then that comes close to what Proust was saying, which is really that suffering helps us. Anyway, there are a number of chapters that delineate Proust's thought, but I'll dip into one which is a chapter on friendship, and it's entitled How to Be a Good Friend. Proust had some rather unusual thoughts about friendship. He was an extremely good friend. He had a lot of friends. They all loved him. He was considered a wonderful friend to have. Just to give you a flavour, that my chapter opens with some testimonies of his friends, and they all said that Proust was really absolutely fantastic. One friend of his called Georges de Loris tells us that, points to Proust's generosity. In restaurants and everywhere where there was a chance, Marcel would always give enormous tips. This was the case even in the slightest railway station buffet where he would never return. Another friend, Fernand Gregg, tells us that Proust always liked to add a 200% service charge to any meal he had. To quote him, if a dinner cost him 10 francs, Marcel would always add 20 francs for the waiter. But he wasn't just generous. Another friend of his, Walter Berry, tells us that Proust was amazingly curious. Marcel was passionately interested in his friends. Never have I seen less egoism or egotism. Anyway, I could go on, but his friends are basically telling us that Proust was an extremely special man who one would want to be friends with. Given such generous verdicts, it's surprising to find that Proust held some extremely caustic views about friendship. In fact, to find that Proust had an unusually limited conception of the value of his, or indeed of anyone's, friendships. Despite the dazzling conversation and the friendliness, he believed that he could just as well have befriended a settee as talk to a friend. I quote from a passage in his novel which outlines this rather caustic approach. Our friends are only friends in the light of an agreeable folly which travels with us throughout our life, and to which we readily accommodate ourselves, but which at the bottom of our hearts we know to be no more reasonable than the delusion of the man who talks to the furniture because he believes that this furniture is alive. Proust goes on. There are a number of other very pessimistic statements he has, and Proust caps it all by telling us that friendship is in the end no more than a lie which seeks to make us believe that we are not irremediably alone. It doesn't mean that Proust was callous. It doesn't mean he was a misanthrope. It doesn't mean he never had an urge to see his friends. However, Proust was challenging all the more exalted claims often made on friendship's behalf. Principal among these is the claim that our friends afford us a chance to express our deepest selves, and that the conversations we have with them are a privileged forum in which we can finally say what we really think, and by extension, be who we really are. This claim was not dismissed out of bitter disappointment at the calibre of his friends. Proust's scepticism about friendship had nothing to do with the presence at his dinner table of some intellectually rather sluggish characters. The problem that Proust found with friendship and with conversation was in fact far more universal. It was inherent in the idea of friendship, and would for Proust have been present even if he'd had the chance to share his thoughts with great geniuses, with the most profound minds of his generation, which in fact he had the opportunity to do. Because in 1922, both he and James Joyce happened to be at a dinner party, at a black-tie dinner given at the Ritz, for Stravinsky, Diaghilev, and members of the Russian ballet. Joyce arrived late and without a dinner jacket. Proust kept his fur coat on throughout the evening, and what happened once they were introduced was later reported by Joyce to a friend. I'll quote from Joyce's testimony of what happened when he met Proust. Our talk consisted solely of the word non. Proust asked me if I knew the Duc de so-and-so. I said non. Our hostess asked Proust if he'd read such and such a piece of Ulysses. Proust said non, and so on. After dinner, Proust got into his taxi with his hosts, Violet and Sidney Schiff, and without asking, Joyce followed them in. His first gesture was to open the window, and his second to light a cigarette, both of which were life-threatening acts as far as Proust's health was concerned. During the journey, Joyce watched Proust without saying a word, while Proust talked continuously and failed to address a single word to Joyce. When they arrived at Proust's flat at the Rue Hamelin, Proust took Sidney Schiff aside and said, "Please ask Monsieur Joyce to let my taxi drive him home." The taxi did so, and the two men were never to meet again. If this story has an absurd side, it's perhaps because of our awareness of what these two writers could have told one another. A conversation of cul-de-sacs that ends in non is not a surprising eventuality as far as many people are concerned, but it is more surprising, and indeed it's far more regrettable, when it's all that the authors of Ulysses and In Search of Lost Time can find to say to each other when they're seated together under the same Ritz chandelier. However, let's imagine that the evening had unfolded rather more successfully as could have been hoped. What follows is an imaginary dialogue. It's the only part of the book which has a fictional angle, and it's really my attempt to try and imagine what would have happened if Proust and Joyce had hit it off rather more successfully. So I imagine Proust taking furtive stabs at an homard à l'américaine, his favourite seafood, huddled in a fur coat. Proust asks, "Monsieur Joyce, do you know the Duc de Clermont-Tonnerre?" Joyce, "Please, appelez-moi James, le Duc. What a close and excellent friend. He's quite the kindest man I've met from here to Limerick." Proust, "Really? Oh, I'm so glad we agree about the Duke," beaming at the discovery of this common acquaintance, "though I have not yet been to Limerick." Violet Schiff, leaning across with the hostess's delicacy to Proust. "Marcel, do you know James's big book?" Proust, "Ulysses, naturellement! Who has not read the masterpiece of our new century?" Joyce blushes modestly, but nothing can disguise the intensity of his delight. Violet Schiff, "And Marcel, do you happen to remember any passages in it, perhaps?" Proust, "Madame, remember passages? I remember the entire book. For instance, when the hero goes to the library, I can't resist quoting, and excuse my accent anglais, but I simply cannot resist. 'A bane to comfort them, the Quaker librarian purred.'" Anyway, that's the end of that section. And yet, even if it had gone as well as this, even if Proust and Joyce had later enjoyed an animated cab ride home and sat up until sunrise exchanging thoughts on music and the novel, art and nationality, love and Shakespeare, there would still have been a critical discrepancy between the chat and the writing, between Ulysses and for Ulysses and In Search of Lost Time would never have resulted from a dialogue, even though these novels were among the most sustained and the most profound utterances both authors were capable of, a point that highlights the limitations of conversation when viewed as a forum in which we can express our deepest selves. So I go on to elaborate on this objection that Proust had to friendship, namely that with our friends and within the medium of conversation, which is the natural medium of friendship, it's very hard to get ourselves across. There's something about having to talk, respond in a dialogue, which means that we're frequently unable to bring out the best of ourselves, which is incidentally why Proust thought that, or rather asserted that meeting an author, once one has enjoyed the author's books, will always be a disappointment. Because when one meets an author, one only meets this person as they're able to talk in a select moment of time, whereas a book is the product of much elaboration and much thought. So Proust once said in one of his letters, "It's true that there are people who are superior to their books when one meets them, but that's because their books are not really books." So in Proust, when we meet an author whose books we like, we should be disappointed. So anyway, I hope I'm disappointing a sufficient number of you here, and I hope I'm doing a good job of that. It feels like it. Anyway, so... But that was not the only objection that Proust had about friendship. Another objection that he had was about his difficulty of being honest with people. It's often thought that we can tell our friends exactly what's on our minds, that friendship's one of these areas in which we can really express ourselves honestly. But this does depend on two things, and I go on in this chapter to comment on why, on what these things depend on. Firstly, how much is on our minds, how much we feel about our friends, which, if we were to tell them, might actually upset them. And secondly, our evaluation of how quickly other people might break off a friendship with us if ever we were to dare to say things like, you have salad between your teeth, or any other more serious, honest objections. But Proust was not well placed to enjoy honest friendships. For a start, he had far too many true but unkind thoughts about people. When he met a palm reader in 1918, the woman was said to have taken one glance at his hand, looked at his face for a moment, then remarked simply, "What do you want from me, monsieur? It should be you reading my character." But this miraculous understanding of others did not lead to cheerful conclusions. "I feel infinite sadness at seeing just how few people are genuinely kind," Proust wrote once in a letter, and he judged that most people had something rather wrong with them. And this combination, this rather cynical or rather gloomy view of people's faults, was combined with a desperate urge to have people like Proust. He was incredibly insecure about his own value in society, and he wanted people to like him. Anytime he met someone, he was very keen that he would win this person over. He had a number of strategies. One of them was always to ask people questions, and I go on to outline, so if anyone's looking to find a quick and easy ways to make friends, Proust has some wonderful tips. One of them is that we should always try and ask our friends questions about their own lives rather than assert things about our lives. That's just one thing. Proust, for instance, Proust's friend Georges de Loris, who was a very keen rally driver and tennis player, gratefully reported in a memoir that he wrote after Proust's death that he often talked to Proust about sport and motor cars, which is rather surprising because, of course, Proust cared little for either sport or motor cars. But to have insisted on turning the conversation to Madame de Pompadour's childhood, which was one of Proust's particular obsessions, with a man keener on Renault's crankshaft, would have been to misunderstand what friendship was for. And in Proust's view, friendship was really for being kind to our friends rather than being kind to ourselves. Anyway, I go on to describe some of these things, but there were some rather cynical approaches to Proust's own theories of how to win people over, and I'll just read this little passage. "However charming Proust's manners, they might unkindly have been described as somewhat over-polite. So much so that the more cynical of Proust's friends invented a mocking term to describe the peculiarities of Proust's social habits. His friend Fernand Gregg reports, "We created among ourselves the verb to Proustify, to express a slightly too conscious attitude of geniality, together with what would vulgarly have been called affectations, interminable and delicious." A representative target of Proust's Proustification was a middle-aged woman called Laure Heyman, a well-known courtesan who'd once been the mistress of many distinguished men. Proust was in his late teens when he first met and began to Proustify Laure. He would send her elaborate letters dripping with compliments, accompanied by chocolates, trinkets and flowers, gifts so expensive that his father was forced to lecture him on his extravagance. "Dear friend, dear delight," ran a typical note to Laure, accompanied by a little something from the florist. "Here are 15 chrysanthemums. I hope the stems will be excessively long, as I requested." In case they weren't, and in case Laure needed a greater or more enduring token of affection than a collection of long-stemmed plants, Proust assured Laure that she was a creature of what he called voluptuous intelligence and subtle grace. He told Laure that she was a divine beauty, in fact, that she was a goddess who would be able to turn every man who came into her vicinity into a devoted worshipper. It seemed natural to end this letter by offering affectionate regards and the practical suggestion that "I propose to call the present century the century of Laure Heyman." Laure became Proust's friend. Was he an extraordinary hypocrite, then? The word implies that beneath an appearance of goodwill and kindness lay a sinister, a calculating agenda, and that Proust's real feelings for Laure Heyman could not possibly have matched these extravagant declarations. But the disparity may be less dramatic. No doubt Proust believed precious few of his Proustifications, but he nevertheless remained sincere in the message that had inspired and that underlay them. "I like you, and I would like you to like me." The exaggerated scale of Proust's social politeness shouldn't blind us to the degree of insincerity that every friendship demands. The ever-present requirement to deliver an affable but hollow word to a friend who proudly shows us a volume of her poetry or her newborn baby. To call such politeness hypocrisy is to neglect that we have lied in this local way, not in order to conceal fundamentally malevolent intentions, but rather to confirm our feelings of affection, which might have been doubted if there had been no gasping and no praising, because of the unusual intensity of people's attachment to their verse and their children. In fact, there seems a gap between what others need to hear from us in order to trust that we like them, and the extent of the negative thoughts we know we can feel towards them and still like them. We know it's possible to think of someone as absolutely dismal at poetry, but actually quite charming. To think of someone as both perceptive and yet boring, both inclined to pomposity and yet charming, both suffering from halitosis and yet genial. But the susceptibility of others means that the negative part of this equation can rarely be expressed without jeopardizing the negative part of the equation. Anyway, I'll stop it there, which is really, that gives you a flavor of what Proust is raising about, his objections that he's raising about friendship. And Proust goes on to then to offer some very handy hints about how we should behave in social life. And his advice gives name to the title of this chapter, which is called How to Be a Good Friend. And you'll find other chapters in here on such things, just to sort of take you through the table of contents on how to take your time, how to suffer successfully. Proust was very keen on suffering successfully. Perhaps we'll have a chance to talk about that. He also tells us about how to be happy in love, which might not, if any of you know Proust's own love life, might seem a bit of a paradox. But anyway, he has some wonderful advice on love. And finally, he tells us how to put books down, which is a chapter on how we should not take books too seriously. But anyway, I'll stop it there, and I hope that's given you a sense of what might be inside. And if there are any questions about Proust or this book, I'd be happy to try and answer them. And if any of you have particular problems, I'd love to answer them. And I'd love to try and second guess what Proust might have said about them. So anyway, if there are any questions, thank you.
Would you accept a statement?
Sorry?
Would you accept a statement?
Would I accept a statement? Certainly.
I'm not disappointed in you.
You're not disappointed. Well, that's very kind. But Proust does insist that meeting authors should be a disappointment. But thank you anyway. I'll try and disappoint you later. But. Does anyone else? Yes.
Well, I just thought that I have 3 of these books now, and I'm giving them as gifts.
Oh my
It
God!
just seems
I should give you a commission.
That, the way you said it, what you said, the way you wrote your book was all such good advice to young writers, of whom I know quite a few. And they look at the books and say, well, I don't know. I know about Proust, and I've done this and that. But it's your book that they. What is it about? I don't know myself.
Right. Well, that's extremely. I guess. So your question is really, what is it about this book that might be of help to a young writer?
Very different from this. And
Right.
Say, look, and here's, oh, I want to spend some time with this.
Right. I suppose this is. There are many things in this book that would help someone who's writing, because Proust wrote a lot about writing. He was quite self-conscious about the process and what makes a good book. And of course, what's interesting is that Proust draws some interesting similarities between what makes a good book and what makes a happy life. In his view, good writing is in a way good living. When we're writing well, we're noticing what's important, we're expressing ourselves clearly, all of things which should really go on even if one doesn't write books. So Proust makes some great claims for art, and he talks a lot about art, but I think it would be wrong to say he's just concerned with writing. I think a good writer, hopefully in a good writer, other things are going right as well. So, but anyway, I'm delighted that it should be of help to your friends who are writing. So that's great. Are there any other? Yes. Sorry.
To me, sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead.
To me, between the lines, I've been reading a big book for 8 years now, and I'm up to the captive, really.
Right.
And I never got what you are delineating and writing about, not in the same way. But the thing that I like about what you're pointing out, and I think I began to see it in Proust, is that the theme of all of Proust is not time, it's about awareness.
Right. Yes. So the point is.
Consciousness and awareness.
Right. Right. I guess so. The point is that Proust is often, if one asks oneself what is Proust talking about, often the academic answer is, well, this is a book about time and memory and all these things that seem rather abstract. And I don't know, if someone told me this is a book about time and memory, my mind would kind of go blank. I wouldn't know what that meant. What I've tried to do in writing this book is to slightly redraw the grid of how one writes a book about Proust. Most academic books are written very dutifully. It would have been very easy for me to write a standard academic sort of guide through Proust. I wanted to write a book that would be that could be read by people who hadn't read Proust and also by people who had, but also I wanted to write a book that would try and bring out Proust's relevance. It's a striking feature of Proust that though he was living and writing about Paris in the late 19th century, one doesn't have to be in Paris, one doesn't have to speak French, one doesn't have to have had any kind of contact with the world that Proust describes in order to be able to have real connection with him. And I think that's because Proust very much believed in the universality of certain human situations. So reading Proust, one often finds in kind of daily life moments when one thinks, God, that's so Proustian. And I think what one means by that is this is a moment where Proust would have made one aware of certain things. He would have sensitized us to certain things, and I'm seeing that now in daily life. I think it's a feature of many good books that they help to make us aware of things about our own world and about our own life that we wouldn't otherwise have known. It's that paradoxical thing that a book which is written by someone else has that strange effect of being able to tell you about yourself. Someone else is able to tell you more about yourself than you were on your own able to deduce. And I think that in that way, Proust's book and hopefully my book, in the sense that it's a reading of Proust, does bring out that effect that great literature has. Are there any? Sorry. Yes, sorry, at the back, yeah.
I wondered if you'd answer a question for me. It's not exactly about Proust, because I confess I haven't had a chance to read your book yet. I just discovered the Romantic movement last week.
Right.
And then I heard you were coming tonight, and I had to come and ask you this question.
Right.
What is your opinion? And you can answer as Proust would answer, as you would personally answer, however you choose.
Yeah.
What is your opinion on the nature of attraction? Is it natural or is it manipulation? And do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, okay, all right. So the gentleman just had a question about what is the nature of attraction, and is it natural or is it kind of manufactured? Huge question. Let's see, where does one start? Well, what Proust would have said, Proust had some rather dark views about love, and perhaps I can just sort of highlight some of those in this chapter, which is called How to Be Happy in Love. It takes the form of a kind of Q&A in my book, and it just to give you a flavour, the Q is, did Proust have any relevant thoughts on dating? What should one talk about on a first date, and is it good to wear black? The answer is that advice is scant from Proust, and a more fundamental doubt is whether one should accept dinner in the first place. And I quote from Proust, "There is no doubt that a person's charms are less frequently a cause of love than a remark such as, 'No, I'm sorry, this evening I shan't be free.'" So Proust would very much have been in tune with that book, the rules in which one's advised to not be free for dinner very often, and he has some more, I think, more sophisticated reasons for saying that. But he's very much he's very aware of the fact that once one is together with someone, their attraction can pale. One can be more or less pessimistic about that, and I have fluctuating views on the subject myself that I don't really want to go into. But I think it's an undeniable feature that very often the moments of greatest passion are when there's insecurity in a relationship. And Proust tells us rather helpfully, the cue in this section of this sort of Q&A is, are there any secrets to long-lasting relationships? And the answer is infidelity, not the act itself, but the threat of it. For Proust, an injection of jealousy is the only thing capable of rescuing a relationship ruined by habit. And he gives us a word of advice for someone who's taken the fatal step of cohabitation. I hear a tut in the corner. I hope that... Anyway, it's dark advice, and one can take it or leave it. But anyway, Proust tells us, and one has to brace oneself for this, when you come to live with a woman, you will soon cease to see anything of what made you love her at first. Though it's true that the two sundered elements can be reunited by jealousy, so his advice to men and women is that jealousy adds a certain spice to relationships. I mean, that can make it sound very superficial. Proust does go into this much deeper, and it's all about his theory of how we can appreciate things and how difficult it is to appreciate things which are physically present. In his view, the best way of appreciating something is imaginatively. It's when we conjure up something in our imagination that we're most able really to savor it. Proust's advice, incidentally, on going on holiday is that we shouldn't go on holiday. We should simply go and get from the travel agent some brochures and then look at the brochures and dream and imagine, and that's going to be the best holiday. Actually, to go to Hawaii or wherever is taking things so literally that we should desist. So anyway, that's Proust's advice on holidays and in a way on dating. So. Are there any other? I think there was a question. Sorry, were you trying to ask?
Yeah, I've tried to read Proust a number of times and have not been able to do it. Can I just skip it and read your book?
Right. The question. The lady's tried to read Proust a number of times and has not had any success. And the question is, can she skip and just read my book? I think read my book anyway. But can you read Proust? I don't know. Let's see. I mean, I was doing a talk show in Boston the other day, a radio phone-in, and lots of people were calling in and were sharing their memories of Proust, and it had a very erudite kind of Cambridge atmosphere. People were sharing intimate moments that they'd had with Proust on air, and anyway, it was very almost precious, one could say. And this lady called in, and she went, and she was on her mobile phone, and she said in the car, and she said, I'm driving down the highway, and I've got to tell you, I've tried reading Proust about 3 times, and it's a load of nonsense. And I'd just like all of you listeners out there to know that not everyone has to like Proust, and that one can be normal and not like Proust. And then she hung up. So that was the end. There was no chance of dialogue. But I think good for her. And it's true that like all sources of advice, like all good books, not everyone's going to like them, often for good reasons. So I think one should be very relaxed in the face of either liking or not liking Proust. That's my Californian advice for them for here. So.
His brother said from your book that the only way to read his brother's book was to break your leg and be
that's right. Proust said that given the length of he said his brother's book was wonderful. The only problem was that it took so long to read, and that he said the only way one could read it was A, to have broken a leg, or B, to have caught tuberculosis. These would be 2 ways. Tuberculosis is rarer and rarer these days, so that's a problem. So one should really break a leg. So there we are. Yeah. Are there any other questions on Proust or?
Comments,
remarks?
I feel like a hog.
No, please, go ahead. Yeah.
Do you think that Proust had any deliberate desire to make his big book into a...
Right. Did Proust have any deliberate desire to help other people? I mean, that's an interesting question. When Proust was near the end of his life, he said to his maid that... Sorry, just to preface that, Proust's father had been one of the greatest doctors of his generation. He was an author of what one would today describe as self-help manuals, but physical self-help. He wrote books called The Hygiene of the Body, which was about how to maintain good aerobic flow and develop one's muscles. And he illustrated these books, and they were great bestsellers in his day. And if one walked into a bookshop, one would think of Proust as Dr. Proust, who was Marcel's father. But towards the end of his life, when his father had died, Proust said to his maid that he wished that he could do as much for the sick as his father had done, that he with his books could help people as much. And I guess that brings out an interesting therapeutic sort of ambition that Proust had, which was really to help other people. The question is, would he have approved of my book? Would he? I mean, I know people have said, what would he have said about your book?
Too short.
Well, not necessarily too short. He would be extremely polite. As we know, he would have done a Proustification. So he would have told me it was wonderful, etc., and then he would have returned and in his novel written caustic remarks about this upstart who's writing these books. So I think that's maybe what he would have said.
Well, that's what you said about awareness. That's what's so important about your book, because it does emphasize awareness, not just in writing, but in living and in reading.
Right.
The whole thing. And just that one word, really.
Right, so highlighting the word awareness.
That's the helpful.
Yeah, I mean, Proust tells us that books have this wonderful he pens some interesting lines on how we should approach books. He tells us that books are wonderful at making us more aware of the world, and that a good book should sort of enlighten us and aliven us to things. And that's happened a lot with Proust. There are lots of testimonies of people reading Proust. So, for instance, when Virginia Woolf first read Proust, she was absolutely bowled over. She said, she talked about how amazing it was that he'd been able to put into words sensations that she'd had but had never been able to express. And so there's that very beneficial aspect of reading. Though Proust does go on to warn us that a very reverent regard to books, a kind of awe of great writers, can often inhibit us. So he tells us that he tells us at one point that that a great love of literature should always be combined with the ability to have a good laugh at it. He says this in a letter to André Gide, that we should always have a good laugh about literature. And I think he wasn't saying laughing just for the hell of it. I think what he was saying was that we should laugh because that laughter suggests a more spontaneous and natural and uninhibited response to books, which often great books prevent us from having. So one thinks of Proust and one thinks, well, this is going to be very solemn, and that solemnity is a kind of fake respect, or rather it's a respect that's not going to bring us anything. And so that's why Proust says that we should always have a certain distance and a certain irreverence towards books. Are there any other questions, or is that it? So I think that may be it. So anyway, thank you all for coming, and I hope that Proust changes your lives in some way, and that you're very disappointed in me. So thanks very much.